Paul's going to make an incredible point in Romans 4 that's imperative for us today. It's really, really important because the way that the world views religion, the way the world reviews some of the biggest questions in life, where do we come from, why are we here, what happens after we die, are all directly related to what Paul's going to tell us in Romans chapter 4. What they call that your worldview. And everybody attempts to answer these basic questions. Everybody attempts to answer, why are we here? Where did we come from? Why are we here? And what happens when we die? Those are some of the biggest questions that anybody has in their life. And our worldview struggles with trying to answer those questions. And so when we look at what the Bible has to say about that, God shows us the truth of how those things really are. And so let's do a little bit of review to see what got us to this point. And then Paul's going to drive home one major theme that's going to make it really important for us this morning. So here's the first thing. One of the things that we've learned over the first 3 chapters of the book of Romans is that we are designed to worship. We're designed for worship. And that's just how we're created. It's part of our DNA. And here's the issue that we have is that if we don't worship God, we were designed to worship specifically God. If we don't worship God, we will worship something else. Because that's how we are. We're designed that way. We're created for worship, and so we will worship something. And so the first chapter of the book of Romans, Paul goes into this in detail of how we replace God with something else. It could be a stone idol. It could be animals. It could be an ideal. It could even be something good, right? When we replace the worship of God, it doesn't matter what we replace it with. It could be a good thing. It could be a bad thing. It could be an inanimate thing. It doesn't matter. It replaces God in our worship and therefore becomes idolatry, right? It becomes sin because even if it's a good endeavor, we've overindulged in that endeavor to the point of worship. Because we're designed to worship. We have to have something. We have to. We cannot exist without worshiping something. That's just who we are. And so when we replace God, when we worship something other than God, we dive headlong into sin. And so Paul wants us to understand that we're designed for worship, and that so often what we do is we replace the object of that worship from our original design. Here's the second thing we've learned so far, is that we're all guilty by even our own standards, right? Louis Schaefer said this. He came up with this concept of recording every word that you would ever say. Imagine if you had a recording device around your neck from birth on, and your entire life, every conversation that you had was recorded. Every judgmental comment, let's be very specific. As we judge others, chapter 2 kind of digs into this a little bit. As we judge others, we create a standard of behavior. As we speak and the things that we say, if at the end of our lives we stood before God and God took that tape recorder and played it back and we were judged just by our own standards, we would fall short, wouldn't we? Because how many times do we condemn somebody for stealing, and yet we've taken extra time from our employer at some point, right? Some of you may have taken things that didn't belong. We've appropriated things. This really corresponds with Jesus' Sermon on the Mount when the law says, don't kill, right? But Jesus goes a step farther. He said, even if you have hate for somebody in your heart, even if you have anger toward them, you've already committed the sin inside. So he says, even if we were judged by our own standards, if we were to judge on the standard of lust, the law says no adultery, right? But Jesus said in his sermon that if you had lust in your heart for a woman, you've already committed adultery in your heart. So those things, if we were just judged by our own standards, we would fall short. And so if we can't even hold up to our own standard, how much less could we hold up to the complete holiness and righteousness of God? If God's standard is absolute holiness, not just relative holiness, not you've heard the phrase holier than thou attitude. That's a comparison. That doesn't work because God's not concerned with how holy you are. He's concerned with whether you are completely holy or not. And we all are in the not category, right? So we can't even handle our own standard. How much more so would we be guilty under God's standard? Because the reality is we were created in innocence. When God first created Adam, he was completely innocent. Just imagine the world without sin, without pain, without death. The innocence of that environment, to not even know evil exists. And so that's how we were designed, that's how we were created. But we sin now by nature and by choice. By one man's sin entered into the world, so through Adam, sin entered into the world, and death by sin. And so death passed to all people because all have sinned. So we're all in this category. By nature and by choice, we fall into this. So then the really bad news hits in chapter 3. And Paul tells us that there's none righteous, no, not one. Which this is a problem for us, because if we're looking for a solution to the issue, it can't come from us. Because there's none of us who are good enough. There's none of us who are righteous enough for their own selves, much less righteous enough to help us fix the issues that we have, to fix the sin problem. So we need to understand that it doesn't matter where we come from, what part of the world, it doesn't matter what race or nationality we're from, it doesn't matter how much we have or don't have, it doesn't matter how skilled we are or unskilled, it doesn't matter how much we know. We can know everything about the Bible, and that's not the qualifying factor. Right? We are all in the same boat. There's none righteous, not even one. But then in the end of chapter 3, Paul turns this corner, and he wants us to understand that there's hope, right? Even at our most hopeless situation, in our most dire need, God came to us providing hope. When we could not come to God, and we were hopeless, dead in our trespasses and sins, God came to us. And so the hope comes because God came. And so it doesn't matter where we come from, we're all in the same boat, but God also came for all of us so that we all have hope in Christ. Last week we talked specifically about this idea that God is the just and the justifier. Because here's the problem, is that God can't just say that it's all okay. We'll just forgive you of your sin and just be good from here on out. Because that doesn't change our nature, first of all. Second of all, it's contrary to God's nature. Because God is perfectly holy, perfectly righteous, but he's also perfectly loving. So the cross itself, let's think about the uniqueness and power of the cross. Because in this single action where God became flesh, dwelt among us, sacrificed himself on a cross, the only one that did not deserve death, took death on for us all. Think about this one act now completely satisfies both the holiness of God and the lovingness of God. So God's attribute of love and God's attribute of holiness are perfectly satisfied in this one act. So God can now say that you're forgiven, not just because he's winking at sin, right? God says you're forgiven because it's justified, it's paid for. So God can stand and he can keep within his character and be just, that sin deserves punishment, but at the same time he says your punishment is paid for. The cross completes it all. And so here's the really great part about this, is that God could have saved us and left us, right? Would that not have been mercy? Would that not have been grace, right? We wouldn't have deserved that at all. Where God took us in our sinful nature and he redeemed us and he said, okay, I've fixed the sin problem. Now go do your best. I fixed the sin problem, so we're no longer enemies. The war's over, peace has been declared, but you still have to make this on your own. He went a step further than that. He not only redeems us and pays the price for our sin, but he invites us into his own family. We're his children now. You see the distinction there. God could have been perfectly holy, perfectly just, perfectly loving, and said that was enough, and it would have been. But God is extravagant in his love. He's relentless with his love, that he goes above and beyond and farther than we could ever imagine. And not only did he just solve the sin problem and put us in right standing with God, but he drew us in and brought us close. So now we're in the very family of God. He not only redeems us, but he calls us his own. We sang in the song this morning that that God is a friend of mine. How awesome is that statement? That God didn't just leave us out in the cold to fend for ourselves. He brought us into his own house. So now we get to Romans chapter 4. There's a lot of moving parts in these first 3 chapters to get us to this point, but here's the problem that Paul needs to deal with now, is that this is great news. This is fantastic news. That those who are dead in their trespasses and sins don't have to stay there. That's amazing. But it's even more amazing because it is the only way to go from death to life. And so Paul's going to address this in Romans chapter 4, that this salvation, this great and amazing good news that Christ is giving to us is not only a way to God, it is the only way to God. And this is an important distinction. And so the way that he does that is he goes back to the Old Testament saints, because the cross happened in their lifetime. A lot of these people saw it. A lot of those were in Jerusalem at the time. They have gone back to Rome. So he's writing this letter to people who who may have seen the crucifixion or heard that first sermon that Peter preached on the day of Pentecost. A lot of these believers may have been in Jerusalem at the time. That's how Rome got the church in the first place. That's how the believers started there, is these people from Jerusalem expanded outward and settled into Rome. Whether they were visiting or whether they had moved there, we don't know all the situations that are there, but there was this group of believers in Rome, most likely coming from Jerusalem or being influenced by Jerusalem. So the cross was in their lifetime. They saw it. They knew when it happened. They understood the ramifications of it. But how did people before the cross, how was their sin dealt with? Because Jesus told a story, and he tells the story of the rich man and Lazarus, right? And he tells it very uniquely. This is not a parable. The way that Jesus tells parables lets you know that it's a parable. When he tells a fictional story, there's the markings of a fictional story all over it. He's very clear when he's telling fiction, because he uses parables to illustrate heavenly principles, because there's these big concepts he wants us to understand, so he illustrates that, which is why you have preachers today that use a ton of illustrations, because we're just trying to be like Jesus, right? God uses these illustrations to share these messages, and he does so in a powerful way. This story is unique because it's not a parable. This is a historical fact. This is something that happened. The rich man and Lazarus were real people. And when they died, this was a real thing. Some of the people that he was speaking to at that moment may have known one or both of these characters. They may have been familiar with Lazarus the beggar. They may have given him a small coin on their way to whatever they were doing for the day. They may have helped him get from one place to the other. So they were very familiar with these people. This is a real story with real people. In this story, Jesus tells of the rich man and Lazarus when they pass away, going to their separate places. Lazarus goes to a place called Abraham's bosom, paradise, this place before the cross that the Old Testament saints would have been a part of. And then there's another place that's a place of torment. That's where the rich man finds himself. And the rich man looks up and he sees Abraham. And he has a conversation with Abraham. So here's what we know from this. We're not going to dig into that story because that's not part of what we're talking about this morning. That's a whole other sermon later on, right? But here's what we know is that Abraham was a real guy. And he was part of this real story that Jesus tells in the New Testament. Abraham, after his death, was in a place for the saints. So how do the saints become justified before the cross? Paul's going to deal with this issue because it shows that there's only one way to God. It doesn't matter if you were before the cross, if you're after the cross. It doesn't matter what part of the world you're from. There's no other religion. There's no other pathway to get to God. There's no other set of thoughts. There's no other worldview. There's no other circumstance that will find your way to God except through Jesus Christ. And he wants to use Abraham as an example to show us this. And so he explains this as we go through so that we can understand how people in the Old Testament came to know Christ. So in chapter 4, verse 1, it says, "What shall we say that Abraham, our forefather, according to the flesh, has found? For if Abraham was justified by works, he has something to boast about, but not before God. For what does the Scripture say? Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness." We're going to find there the first faith component when it comes to Abraham. "Now to the one who works, his wage is not credited as a favor, but as what is due. But to the one who does not work, but believes in him who justifies the ungodly, his faith is credited as righteousness." So here's what he's saying here. He said, if I work a job, and the understanding is if I get paid so much per hour, so if I work this hour, I should get paid this much. So if my employer then gives me a check for that amount, it's not the grace of the employer that's blessing me with this check. I earned that, right? There's a contractual thing. That's mine even before he gives it to me. He's in debt to me until he hands me that check, right? Because I've given him something in return for something else. And he says if Abraham were saved by works, whether that be through the law or through whatever it is, then he had something to boast about. But he doesn't, because his works did not credit him as righteousness. What it says is Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. Paul's quoting an Old Testament passage here to prove his point that there is no wage that produces righteousness. Because if so, then that's not grace. It's the faith as the conduit of God's grace. And so we go along, and now he's going to talk about David for a second. And he says, just as David also speaks of the blessings on the man to whom God credits righteousness apart from works. Blessed are those whose lawless deeds have been forgiven and whose sins have been covered. Blessed is the man whose sin the Lord will not take into account. And then he says, is this the blessing on the circumcised or the uncircumcised also? For if we say faith was credited to Abraham as righteousness, how then was it credited? Was he while he was circumcised or uncircumcised? And this is a direct correlation to the giving of the law and the covenant that God made with Israel. And so what Paul's saying here is all of this happened before the covenant was made. All of this happened before the sign of circumcision was given, the symbol of the covenant, right? In the New Testament church, we have a symbol of our covenant also. We have baptism. And baptism is an outward sign of an inward event. Circumcision was very much the same thing. It was an outward sign of an inward covenant with God. God had his covenant people. And they were to take the law, and they were to use that and try to measure up against that, understanding that no one can measure up against the law. It's designed to show us our sin nature. But they were to take that, and not only take that, but be able to spread that throughout the world. They were to be the beacon of light to all the nations. And so when he's talking about Abraham, he says, did these things happen as part of that covenant? Was it because he kept the law that he was credited as righteous? No, all this happened beforehand. Before the symbol of circumcision happened, Abraham believed God, and it was credited as righteousness. So here's a couple things to know about this. First of all, faith is important for salvation. But faith does not save you. And let me be very careful, because this is borderline heresy right here, but I want you to understand. God saves you. The cross of Christ is what saves us. Faith is the conduit. The cross of Christ is the power source, right? Faith is required, but it is not the component that saves. The sacrifice of Christ on the cross is what saves us. The faith that we have is a required component, but it's not the piece of the puzzle. Timothy Keller puts it this way: if my child asks me for a cookie and I give him a cookie, his request did not produce a cookie, right? I produced the cookie. I took it out of the bag and I gave it to him. If my wife's involved, she baked it herself and gave it to him, right? So the request is not the action. The request is the conduit that precipitates the action. God's grace, the cross of Christ, is what saves us, but faith is required. So when it says this, Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. He had a faith component, and God took care of the rest. God says, I take your faith, and I produce action based on that faith. I credited that, he credited to Abraham as righteousness. So here's the bottom line of this, is God in his good grace defers the wrath of sin in the Old Testament. He pushes it forward. So the Old Testament saint, they had a series of sacrifices and different things that they were supposed to do. But none of that was meant to be permanent. None of that was meant to solve the sin problem. What it was meant to do is highlight the sin problem and demonstrate faith. So we trust God because he told us to do these things. We will do these things. But those things in and of themselves did not solve the sin problem. God deferred his wrath, and he paid for it on the cross. So the Old Testament saints look forward to the cross. We on this side of history look back to the cross, but it's still the same saving mechanism for both. We're all come to Christ the same way. We all come to God the same way through the cross of Christ. Abraham didn't understand that. He couldn't understand that because he didn't see the scope of human history. All he did was have a simple trust that God was going to do what was best. And so Abraham believed God. God credited to him his righteousness. And then he paid for that sin on the cross. He did so with every other saint, all the way up to the cross of Christ. So the price for all sin was paid there. Not just the sin from here on out. Everything was covered in this one act. So even though Abraham didn't understand the final solution, he just knew that God would provide the solution. And we all know the story of Abraham and Isaac as they go up on the mountain, and we have this phrase, God will provide for himself a sacrifice. And in that moment, he does, and Isaac is spared, right? But even more so, I think Abraham had this ingrained in him that God would provide for himself the sacrifice, that over time, they wouldn't understand yet, but eventually the sin problem would be taken care of, and that sacrifice was Jesus on the cross. The cross is the only way for salvation. There is no other. This is why our gospel is so important, right? There's no other thought system that will send you to the throne room of God. There's no other religious practice. There's no other deity. There's no other dontity, if you want. I don't know if that's a word, but we can make it, right? There's no other pathway. There's no way to get to God except through Jesus Christ. And this is why this is so important for us. Because the common misconception now is that may be true for you. I don't know if you guys have heard that phrase before. But yeah, what you guys believe, that's great. You guys are doing great work there. You can't deny that stuff is happening in this church, right? You can't deny that God's changing lives. And that may be true for you. But I'm going to do this. But see, that doesn't work because there's no other way. The thought system is that as long as everybody just does good and has good intentions, we'll arrive at the same point. And that's just not true. And it's not loving for us to not share the truth. So faith was credited as righteousness. And here's what that does, is that gives us the position of we can't glorify or boast in and of ourselves, right? This is tough for us because faith is a component, right? Faith is the conduit, the cross is the power source. But we can't put too much emphasis on the faith saves component, because that gives us a reason to boast. The reason we could say to ourselves, the reason I'm in church and that God loves me and God's blessing me is because I had faith and they didn't. And so there's a boasting there. There's a glorification of self there that we have to be very careful of. The only thing that we glorify and the only thing that we boast in is the cross of Christ. Because it is nothing in and of ourselves. Because here's the reality. All of us are sinners, right? We go back to chapter 3. There's none righteous, no, not one. None that seek after God. So where did you get your faith? How did you arrive at the place where you were able to seek God and believe God? That in and of itself is a gift of God. The very thing that brings us to God is actually a gift from God. The faith that we have comes from his hand. It doesn't come from us, right? Now, I believe that God offers that to everyone, right? I believe that every single person on the face of the earth has the same opportunity. But let's not for a moment boast and think about ourselves as finding this thing and being intellectually or morally superior. We're not. Even the faith that we have is given to us. But this is why it's so important for us to share that faith, because God's plan for the world to hear about Jesus is not a big spectacle in the sky, right? God could have the angel armies come down, have a big trumpet solo in the middle of the sky, and make an extravagant appearance. God could come down, send an angel or another representative. He could send Moses or somebody and have a conference on CNN tonight and share with the entire world what's going on. But God in his infinite wisdom chose you and me. We're the ones that he entrusted with the most important message in human history. God entrusted us to share his love, his grace, and his mercy. And we don't have to do it on CNN. We can just walk across the street and share it with our neighbor, right? We can just sit down with somebody at work and talk in the break room. God didn't expect us to be all Billy Graham all of a sudden, right? He just expected us to share it with somebody. Because if each one of us shared it with one person, and they shared it with one person, it wouldn't take long for the entire world to hear about Jesus Christ. It wouldn't take long for everybody on the face of the earth to have had the opportunity to see God change their lives like he's changed ours.